Some men arrive in history like thunder, loud and unmistakable, their names carved immediately into monuments and textbooks. Others move more quietly, leaving behind not statues, but currents, unseen forces that continue to flow long after the man himself has faded from view. Nikola Tesla belonged to the second kind. He lived much of his life in near silence, walking alone through city streets lit by a glow that most people never thought to question. A glow that felt ordinary only because his mind had once imagined it into existence. Tonight's story is not about fame or wealth or victory in the usual sense. It is about a man who carried light inside his thoughts long before it filled homes, streets, and cities. A man who spoke to electricity as if it were a living thing, who listened to storms as though they were messages written just for him, who believed the future could be built quietly, without applause. If gentle, reflective stories like this bring you calm, feel free to subscribe and leave a like. It helps these quiet histories find those who listen in the dark. This is the soft story of Nikola Tesla, the man who lit the world, yet often walked through it alone. Nikola Tesla entered the world not in silence, but beneath a sky split open by light. It was a summer night in 1856, in the small village of Smiljan, tucked within the rolling hills of what was then the Austrian Empire, and a violent storm moved across the land with unusual force. Thunder shook the wooden houses, rain struck the earth in heavy sheets, and lightning carved bright, jagged lines through the darkness. As the story would later be told and retold, Tesla was born at the very height of this storm, at a moment when the sky seemed alive with electricity. The midwife, unsettled by the violence of the weather, is said to have whispered that such a child would be a creature of darkness. But Tesla's mother answered quietly that he would be a child of light. Whether legend or memory shaped by time, the image remained, clinging to his life like a symbolic shadow. A man whose first breath was taken beneath lightning, whose fate would become inseparable from energy itself. Smiljan was not a place that suggested the future. It was rural, slow-moving, bound to tradition and routine, where nights were truly dark and silence ruled once the sun fell behind the hills. Oil lamps and candles provided small islands of warmth in wooden rooms, and when storms came, they were feared rather than studied. Electricity was not a concept here. It was an unknowable force that arrived as fire from the sky and vanished just as suddenly, leaving behind only the smell of rain and scorched earth. In this quiet village, life followed the rhythm of seasons and faith, not innovation. Yet into this setting came a child whose mind would never fully accept the limits of the world as it appeared. Tesla's father, Milutin, was a Serbian Orthodox priest, a man of words, discipline, and strict expectations. He believed in the power of language, memory, and moral structure, and he hoped his son would follow a similar path into the church. His mother, Juka, was very different. She had no formal education, yet possessed a rare mechanical intuition, crafting household tools and devices with her hands, solving practical problems through quiet ingenuity. Tesla would later say that whatever talent he possessed came not from books or instruction, but from her, from watching her mind work effortlessly through physical challenges. In their small home, surrounded by tools, books, and religious icons, two worlds existed side by side, the world of inherited tradition and the world of instinctive invention. From the beginning, Nikola was a sensitive child. He reacted strongly to sound, light, and touch, as though the world reached him with too much intensity. Loud noises startled him deeply. Bright light lingered in his vision longer than it should have. Even ordinary sensations seemed amplified, processed through a nervous system tuned too finely for the rough edges of rural life. Yet this sensitivity was paired with something else, something quieter but more powerful, an unusual awareness of patterns. He noticed repetition where others saw chaos, rhythm where others felt randomness. Even as a boy, he sensed that the storm which marked his birth was not merely violence, but structure, energy moving according to laws not yet understood. The nights in Smiljan left a lasting impression on him. With no artificial light to soften the darkness, the sky revealed itself fully, filled with stars that seemed close enough to touch. Tesla would lie awake, listening to the distant roll of thunder or the hum of insects, watching flashes of lightning illuminate the hills for brief, unforgettable moments. In those flashes, the world appeared frozen and revealed, as though truth itself could be glimpsed if only for an instant. These moments did not frighten him as they did others. Instead, they stirred curiosity, a desire not to escape the storm, but to understand it, to reach into its violence and uncover the rules guiding its movement. As he grew older, Tesla's imagination became increasingly vivid, sometimes to an unsettling degree. He experienced intense visual images that appeared uninvited, fully formed, and impossibly real. Faces, objects, scenes, entire mechanisms would flash before his mind's eye with such clarity that he could scarcely distinguish them from the physical world. For most children, imagination faded as reality pressed in. But for Tesla, the opposite occurred. His inner world grew sharper, brighter, more detailed, while the outer world sometimes felt distant and unreal. This ability would later become the foundation of his work, allowing him to design complex machines entirely in his mind, testing and refining them without touching a single tool. But in childhood, it was simply another sign that he lived slightly out of step with the world around him. Illness visited him early as well. There were periods when he hovered close to death, his body weakened by fever, his breathing shallow, his family uncertain whether he would survive the night. In these moments, Tesla later recalled experiencing a strange calm, a sense of distance from his physical form, as though his consciousness could step aside and observe rather than suffer. These experiences shaped his view of life and death, convincing him that existence extended beyond the visible and measurable, that energy itself might be more fundamental than flesh. Where others feared mortality, Tesla grew quietly fascinated by the idea that nothing truly disappeared, that everything transformed. Despite his fragility, there was a quiet intensity in him that refused to be extinguished. He learned quickly, memorizing long passages of text with ease, absorbing languages, mathematics, and stories with a hunger that surprised his teachers. Yet, he was not driven by ambition in the ordinary sense. He did not seek praise or competition. His motivations seemed internal, as though he were responding to a call no one else could hear. When his father urged him toward a life of sermons and scripture, Tesla listened respectfully, but felt an unspoken resistance grow within him. Words alone were not enough. He wanted to touch the invisible, to grasp forces that shaped the world silently and continuously. Looking back, it is tempting to see his stormy birth as prophecy, to frame his life as inevitable, pre-written by lightning and thunder. But the truth is quieter and more human. Tesla was not born with knowledge of electricity or destiny. He was born with sensitivity, curiosity, and an unusual relationship with energy, both within himself and in the world around him. The storm did not define him. It merely echoed something already present, something that would take decades of isolation, struggle, and quiet obsession to fully emerge. In the small village of Smiljan, under skies that still darkened completely at night, Nikola Tesla took his first steps in a world not yet ready for what his mind would one day reveal. The lightning that marked his arrival faded into memory, but the question it left behind did not. What if the forces that frightened humanity most were not enemies to be feared, but languages waiting to be learned? And what if a single life, begun in thunder, could someday teach the world how to listen to light? As Nikola Tesla grew from infancy into childhood, it became clear to those around him that he was not shaped for an ordinary life, though nothing about his appearance suggested greatness or danger. He was small, thin, quiet, and often withdrawn, a boy who preferred observation to participation and silence to noise. In the village of Smiljan, where children learned early to work with their hands and speak plainly, Tesla stood apart, not because he refused to belong, but because his inner world demanded more space than the outer one could provide. He listened more than he spoke, watched more than he acted, and carried within him a constant current of thought that rarely found words. Tesla's mind was unusually sensitive, almost painfully so. Sounds struck him with force, sometimes overwhelming him to the point of physical discomfort. A clattering dish or a sudden shout could feel like an assault, reverberating through his body long after the noise had ended. Bright light lingered in his vision, imprinting itself behind his eyes. Patterns appeared everywhere, in shadows, in movements, in the repetition of daily routines, and once noticed, they refused to let go. This sensitivity isolated him from other children, who often found him strange or distant, but it also sharpened his perception, turning ordinary moments into fields of silent analysis. More unusual still were the images that filled his mind. Tesla later described how vivid mental pictures would appear without warning, complete and detailed, as real to him as anything he could touch. Objects he had never seen, machines that did not yet exist, scenes that felt remembered rather than imagined would rise before him, sometimes so intensely that he struggled to distinguish thought from reality. These visions were not dreams or fantasies. They were precise, structured, and persistent. At times, they frightened him. At other times, they fascinated him. But they never left him. Where other children played, Tesla rehearsed ideas in silence, testing possibilities in a space only he could enter. Loneliness became a familiar companion. He had few close friends, not because he lacked kindness, but because conversation felt slow and clumsy compared to the speed of his thoughts. While others spoke in fragments, his mind moved in complete systems. He found comfort in solitude, in long walks through fields and forests where he could let his thoughts unfold uninterrupted. Nature, unlike people, did not demand explanations. Rivers flowed whether understood or not. Wind moved freely, invisible yet undeniable. These quiet forces spoke to Tesla more clearly than human voices ever did, and he began to sense that the world itself was structured by invisible laws waiting to be uncovered. His relationship with his family reflected this divide. His father, devoted to faith and discipline, admired Nikola's intelligence, but worried about his fragility and strangeness. He pushed his son towards structured learning, memorization, and order, hoping that a life in the church would ground him. Tesla complied outwardly, excelling in his studies, mastering languages and literature with ease. Yet inwardly, he felt restless. Words, sermons, and rituals seemed insufficient. They described the world, but did not explain it. His mother, however, understood him in a quieter way. She watched how his attention lingered on mechanisms, how his eyes followed motion, how his hands instinctively traced shapes in the air. Though she rarely spoke of science, her practical creativity validated his instincts. She built tools to solve problems. Tesla wanted to build ideas to solve mysteries. Illness returned during these years, reinforcing his sense of separation from ordinary life. Fevers left him weak, trembling, hovering between consciousness and something else entirely. During these episodes, his visions intensified. He felt detached from his body, as though his mind could exist independently, observing from a distance. Rather than fearing these moments, Tesla grew curious about them. They planted the seed of a belief that energy and consciousness might not be confined to physical form, that the body was merely a vessel through which greater forces passed. This idea would follow him throughout his life, shaping not only his inventions, but his philosophy of existence. Despite his isolation, Tesla excelled academically. Numbers made sense to him in a way words did not. Mathematics felt clean, logical, honest. Unlike human speech, it did not distort meaning or hide intention. Equations revealed relationships directly, without pretense. Tesla absorbed mathematics rapidly, often solving problems in his head that others required paper to approach. Teachers recognized his brilliance, but struggled to guide him. He did not learn step by step. He leapt, arriving at conclusions intuitively, sometimes unable to explain the path he had taken. This made him difficult to teach, and even more difficult to understand. Yet there was no arrogance in him, no desire to dominate or impress. Tesla did not seek attention. If anything, he avoided it. He dressed modestly, spoke softly, and accepted praise with discomfort. His satisfaction came not from recognition, but from alignment, from the rare moments when an idea in his mind matched a structure in the world. These moments felt like harmony, like two frequencies briefly resonating. He lived for those moments, quietly collecting them, unaware that they would one day define his contribution to humanity. As adolescence approached, Tesla's inner world grew even louder. The visions became more structured, more mechanical. He began to see rotating fields, moving forces, invisible flows interacting with precision. He did not yet have the language to describe what he was seeing, but he knew it was real in a way imagination was not. These images demanded expression. They pushed against the limits of silence. And slowly, painfully, Tesla began to understand that he would not be able to remain a quiet observer forever. The mind he carried was not content to watch the world pass by. It wanted to intervene, to reshape, to reveal. But for now, he remained the silent child with the loud mind, walking beneath dark skies, listening to storms, storing questions that had no immediate answers. The village of Smiljan continued its routines, unaware that one of its quietest children was already living decades ahead of his time. And Tesla, still unsure of his place among people, learned to trust the only thing that never failed him: the steady, relentless voice of curiosity humming beneath his thoughts, growing stronger with every passing year. As Nikola Tesla moved toward early adulthood, the difference between his inner world and the visible world became not only noticeable, but defining. Where others required tools, sketches, and repeated trial to shape an idea, Tesla needed only silence. His mind had become a place where machines were not imagined in fragments, but appeared whole, complete, and already moving. Gears turned, fields rotated, forces flowed and balanced themselves without a single line being drawn. He did not design by assembling parts. He perceived systems as living entities, functioning before they had ever been built. This ability, rare to the point of isolation, set him apart even from other gifted thinkers, and it shaped the way he would work for the rest of his life. Tesla later described these visions with striking clarity. When an idea came to him, it did not arrive as a vague concept or an outline needing refinement. It arrived fully formed, vivid and precise, occupying his mind as tangibly as a physical object. He could rotate it, examine it from different angles, test its limits, observe how it responded to stress or failure. If a component wore down or broke in his imagination, he adjusted the design mentally and watched it run again. Weeks, months, even years could pass in this internal workshop before a single piece of metal was ever touched. By the time Tesla committed an idea to paper or construction, it had already lived a full life inside him. This method was not learned. It emerged naturally, shaped by the same sensitivity that had once overwhelmed him as a child. His mind, so easily overstimulated by sound and light, found refuge in structure. Order calmed him. Symmetry steadied his thoughts. Patterns offered relief from the chaos of sensation. In visualizing machines, Tesla was not escaping reality, but organizing it, reducing the noise of the world into coherent systems governed by rules he could trust. Where human interaction felt unpredictable and exhausting, the language of forces felt honest and consistent. Yet this gift came at a cost. Tesla struggled to explain his ideas to others because words felt inadequate, almost crude, compared to the clarity of his inner images. He often assumed that what he saw so plainly must be obvious to those around him, only to be met with confusion or skepticism. Teachers and peers mistook his silence for hesitation, his pauses for uncertainty, when in truth he was simply translating visions into language slow enough for conversation. This gap between perception and expression would haunt him throughout his life, making collaboration difficult and misunderstanding frequent. During this period, Tesla began to experience a growing tension between what he could see internally and what the world around him was capable of understanding. The machines in his mind belonged to a future that had not yet arrived. Materials were crude, power sources were limited, infrastructure lagged behind imagination. And yet, Tesla could not unsee what he had seen. The rotating magnetic fields, the smooth transfer of energy, the possibility of motion without friction or waste continued to replay themselves, demanding realization. He was not dreaming of inventions for personal gain or recognition. He was responding to something that felt inevitable, as though these machines already existed somewhere and merely needed to be uncovered. This sense of inevitability shaped his character. Tesla did not approach invention with excitement or urgency, but with quiet certainty. He did not chase ideas. They arrived uninvited and stayed until acknowledged. He often spoke of discovery rather than creation, as if he were uncovering laws that had always been present rather than imposing human will upon nature. This belief grounded him. It gave his work a philosophical weight that went beyond engineering. To Tesla, invention was not an act of dominance over nature, but a conversation with it, a careful listening followed by respectful response. At the same time, these visions isolated him further from ordinary life. Social gatherings felt trivial. Small talk exhausted him. He preferred long periods of solitude, walking alone while ideas assembled themselves silently. He avoided distractions, not out of arrogance, but necessity. Noise disrupted his mental clarity. Disorder broke the delicate alignment of images in his mind. Even strong emotions could interfere with his internal simulations, and so Tesla learned, unconsciously at first, to discipline his inner life with extreme care. He cultivated routines, habits, and personal rules, not for comfort, but for precision. It was during these years that Tesla began to understand that his way of seeing the world was not shared by most people. And rather than attempting to change himself to fit others, he chose to accept his difference. This acceptance did not come easily. There were moments of doubt, moments when he questioned whether his visions were meaningful or merely illusions. But each time he tested them against mathematics or physical law, they held. The consistency of his inner world reassured him. It obeyed rules. It responded logically. It made sense. Gradually, Tesla's visions began to align more clearly with electricity. He saw energy not as something static or contained, but as motion itself, flowing endlessly, capable of being guided rather than restrained. He imagined currents that alternated naturally, fields that rotated smoothly, power that could travel great distances without loss. These ideas were radical, not because they were reckless, but because they contradicted the dominant assumptions of his time. Direct current, rigid systems, brute force solutions ruled the electrical thinking of the era. Tesla's visions were fluid, elegant, and profoundly efficient. They belonged to a different philosophy entirely. By the time Tesla reached formal engineering studies, he was already ahead of the material being taught. Professors explained principles he had intuitively grasped years earlier through visualization alone. Yet he remained patient, absorbing what was useful, discarding what felt incomplete. He did not rebel openly. He listened, learned, and waited. The machines in his mind continued to evolve, growing more refined, more ambitious, more urgent. He understood now that his task was not merely to see the future, but to survive long enough and remain clear enough to bring fragments of it into the present. This period marked a quiet turning point. Tesla was no longer simply a sensitive child or an introspective student. He was becoming something else, a bridge between imagination and reality, between forces invisible and tools tangible. The visions that once overwhelmed him were now becoming his compass, guiding him steadily forward. He had not yet found the place where these ideas could take form, nor the people willing to listen, but the direction was set. And with every unseen machine that rotated silently in his mind, Tesla moved closer to a future the world did not yet know it needed. There came a period in Nikola Tesla's youth when the future he carried so vividly in his mind nearly vanished before it had the chance to reach the world. His body, always more fragile than his intellect, finally collapsed under the weight of exhaustion, pressure, and relentless inner intensity. What began as ordinary weakness deepened into a severe illness that left him bedridden, drifting in and out of consciousness. his frame reduced to something light and trembling, as though the energy within him had begun to burn faster than the body meant to contain it. For weeks, sometimes months, depending on whose memory told the story, Tesla lay suspended between recovery and death, his breathing shallow, his strength uncertain, the room around him dim and quiet, except for the soft movements of worried family members. During this illness, the world narrowed, ambition disappeared, plans dissolved. The future became a fragile thing, no longer vast and open, but reduced to the simple question of whether another morning would arrive. Doctors spoke in careful tones, offering little certainty. His father, usually composed and authoritative, stood helpless beside the bed, confronting the possibility that the son he had pushed so hard toward duty and discipline might slip away before any path could be chosen at all. Tesla himself later recalled these days not with fear, but with an eerie calm, as though the mind, sensing the body's weakness, had loosened its grip on urgency. And yet, even at the edge of death, Tesla's inner world did not fall silent. If anything, it intensified. Fever sharpened his visions rather than blurring them. Images surged through his mind with overwhelming clarity. Flashes of rotating fields, bursts of light, flowing currents intertwining and separating with perfect precision. These were not comforting hallucinations. They were relentless, demanding attention even when his body could barely respond. Sleep brought no escape, only deeper immersion into this internal landscape where energy ruled everything and matter seemed secondary, almost optional. In these moments, Tesla began to sense something that would shape him permanently. The idea that the mind could exist independently of physical strength, that thought itself was a form of energy not easily extinguished. At the lowest point of his illness, when those around him had begun to lose hope, Tesla experienced a moment of stark clarity. He later described it not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet decision formed in the stillness between breaths. If he survived, he would not live cautiously. He would not dilute his curiosity to protect his health or soften his ideas to make others comfortable. Life, he realized, was too fragile and too brief to be spent half-committed. This was not a vow spoken aloud, but an internal alignment, a setting of direction as precise as any equation. In that moment, obsession ceased to be a weakness and became a necessity. Recovery came slowly, unevenly, like light returning after a long storm. Tesla's body regained strength in fragments. Some days, he could sit up and read. Others, he could barely lift his head. But as physical endurance returned, something else hardened within him, a resolve sharpened by proximity to the end. He no longer feared exhaustion the way others did. He had seen the edge and understood that survival alone was not enough. What mattered was meaning, and meaning, for him, lived entirely in pursuit of understanding. From that point forward, Tesla accepted that his life would not follow ordinary rhythms. Balance, rest, moderation, these were luxuries he was willing to abandon if they interfered with clarity of thought. This decision, though quiet, had consequences. Tesla began to push himself relentlessly, often working through nights without sleep, consumed by ideas that refused to release him. His mind locked onto problems with an intensity that bordered on self-destruction. He could not easily turn his attention away once it had found a question worthy of pursuit. Meals were forgotten, social obligations vanished, time itself seemed irrelevant. Hours passed unnoticed while Tesla stood motionless, lost in mental simulations of machines and forces. To observers, this appeared unhealthy, even dangerous. To Tesla, it felt necessary, as though slowing down would mean losing connection with something fragile and vital. Obsession became both his engine and his anchor. It provided focus, but it also isolated him further from others. Conversation felt increasingly difficult. While people spoke of daily concerns, Tesla's thoughts raced along invisible currents, far removed from ordinary life. He struggled to relate, not because he lacked empathy, but because the problems that consumed him seemed fundamentally different from those that occupied the world around him. He lived inside abstractions, fields, frequencies, flows, while others lived among tangible needs and immediate rewards. The distance grew quietly, almost imperceptibly, until it felt permanent. At the same time, Tesla's relationship with his father began to change. Witnessing his son's near death softened something in Tesla that discipline alone had hardened. When Nikola spoke of his desire to pursue engineering rather than the priesthood, the resistance weakened. The illness had revealed a truth that could no longer be ignored. Forcing Nikola into a life misaligned with his nature might destroy him. And so, reluctantly but sincerely, his father released him from expectations once considered immovable. This moment, small in appearance, altered the course of Tesla's life. For the first time, the path ahead opened without obligation pressing from behind. Yet freedom did not bring peace. It brought intensity. Tesla plunged deeper into study, devouring mathematics, physics, and engineering with ferocious appetite. He did not study to pass exams or impress instructors. He studied to stabilize the visions that filled his mind, to ground them in formal language and law. Knowledge became a scaffold, a way to support ideas too large to exist in isolation. Each formula offered reassurance that his inner world was not madness, but coherence waiting to be shared. Still, the shadow of illness never fully left him. His body remained sensitive, prone to exhaustion and nervous strain. He developed strict personal habits, rules about sleep, cleanliness, repetition, not as quirks, but as survival strategies. Control over his environment became essential to maintaining clarity of thought. Disorder unsettled him deeply. Certain sounds, textures, and even numbers provoked intense discomfort. These sensitivities, amplified by his earlier illness, shaped a life that appeared eccentric from the outside, but internally precise and deliberate. Looking back, it is tempting to view this period as a test, a crucible that purified Tesla's purpose. But in truth, it was something more ambiguous. It forged strength and fragility simultaneously. The same obsession that drove his brilliance also narrowed his world. The same discipline that protected his mind isolated his heart. Tesla emerged from illness not healed in the ordinary sense, but transformed, carrying a body he would always have to negotiate with and a mind he could never silence. Standing at the edge of death had taught him something the healthy often never learn. That time is not guaranteed, and clarity cannot be postponed. From that moment forward, Tesla lived as though each idea mattered, as though every insight might be the last he would have the strength to hold. The world would one day benefit from this urgency, illuminated by currents he dared to imagine. But the cost would be paid quietly, over a lifetime shaped by intensity, solitude, and an unrelenting devotion to forces invisible, yet profoundly real. When Nikola Tesla finally left his homeland, the departure was not dramatic, not marked by ceremony or certainty, but by a quiet resolve shaped by exhaustion and hope in equal measure. Europe had given him education, discipline, and the language of engineering, yet it had also confined him within structures too rigid for the scale of ideas he carried. He moved through cities and institutions where innovation advanced cautiously, constrained by tradition and incremental thinking, and although he learned much, he felt increasingly restless, as though the future he could see so clearly had no room to unfold where he stood. The decision to leave was not driven by ambition alone, but by necessity, by the growing sense that if his ideas were ever to become real, they would need a wider horizon than Europe could offer him at that time. America, in Tesla's imagination, was not a country so much as a direction. It represented motion, expansion, a place where unfinished ideas might be tolerated long enough to become something tangible. He had heard stories of factories rising overnight, of industries forming at breathtaking speed, of men willing to gamble on unproven concepts if they promised progress. To Tesla, this sounded less like recklessness and more like alignment. The world he envisioned required momentum, not patience, boldness, not refinement. And so, carrying little more than a few belongings, a letter of introduction, and a mind crowded with machines that did not yet exist, he boarded a ship bound westward, leaving behind familiar languages, landscapes, and the fragile stability he had fought so hard to regain after illness. The journey itself was long and isolating. Days at sea blurred together, marked by the steady rhythm of waves and the low hum of engines that fascinated Tesla, far more than the conversations of fellow passengers. He spent hours alone on deck, watching the movement of water, studying the behavior of clouds, letting the vastness of the ocean quiet the noise of expectation. There was comfort in this liminal space, suspended between what had been and what might be. No one demanded explanations. No one questioned his silence. The future felt closer here, hovering just beyond the horizon, and Tesla allowed himself to believe that arrival would mean beginning. But when he reached New York, the reality that greeted him was harsher and louder than anything he had imagined. The city was chaotic, crowded, relentless, alive with noise and motion that assaulted his sensitive mind. Streets were narrow and filthy, factories belched smoke into the air, and the rhythm of life felt aggressive rather than expansive. For a man accustomed to solitude and internal order, New York was overwhelming. Yet beneath the noise, Tesla sensed potential. The city pulsed with energy, crude and uncontrolled, but unmistakably powerful. It was a place where systems were being built faster than they could be perfected, where mistakes were tolerated if progress followed, and where electricity, still in its infancy, was becoming the nervous system of a new world. Tesla arrived with almost nothing. Money was scarce, opportunities uncertain. He took what work he could find, often beneath his abilities, performing tasks that required physical endurance more than intellectual engagement. There were moments when doubt crept in quietly, when hunger and fatigue made the future feel distant and abstract. But even in these moments, his inner world remained intact. The machines in his mind did not disappear. If anything, hardship sharpened them. He observed the inefficiencies of existing electrical systems with growing frustration, recognizing flaws that seemed obvious to him but invisible to others. The city itself became a living demonstration of what was wrong with the way power was being generated and distributed. Tesla's entry into the American electrical world came through Thomas Edison, whose name already carried weight and authority. Armed with a letter of recommendation, Tesla approached Edison not with reverence, but with cautious optimism. He admired Edison's productivity and determination, yet sensed immediately that their minds operated on entirely different frequencies. Edison worked through trial and error, through relentless experimentation and practical compromise. Tesla worked through vision, elegance, and theoretical precision. Where Edison trusted persistence, Tesla trusted understanding. At first, this difference did not appear as conflict, it appeared as possibility. Tesla believed that if given the right environment, his ideas could elevate existing systems beyond their limitations. In those early days, Tesla worked tirelessly, often through the night, driven by the belief that he stood on the edge of something transformative. He repaired generators, redesigned components, solved problems others had abandoned as unsolvable. His speed and clarity impressed some, unsettled others. He moved too fast, thought too far ahead, spoke too little. He did not know how to navigate the social architecture of ambition, how to translate brilliance into leverage. He assumed, perhaps naively, that results would speak for themselves. But America, for all its promise, demanded more than ideas. It demanded alignment with power, with money, with personalities that valued control as much as innovation. Tesla, still adjusting to the cultural and emotional distance from his homeland, struggled with this reality. He had come seeking a future built on clarity and possibility, only to find that the path forward was tangled in ego and competition. The light he wanted to give the world would require negotiation, compromise, and endurance beyond technical mastery. Still, despite these challenges, the move west marked an irreversible turning point. Tesla had placed himself at the center of the electrical revolution, surrounded by the raw materials of transformation. The world he envisioned was no longer theoretical. It stood within reach, waiting to be shaped, if he could endure the pressure long enough to shape it. He had crossed an ocean not merely to change countries, but to change the scale at which his ideas could exist. Leaving home had stripped him of familiarity, comfort, and protection, but it had also freed him from limitation. Tesla stood now in a land that had not yet decided what it would become, carrying within him a future that demanded expression. The long road west had not brought certainty or peace, but it had delivered him to the only place where the light he imagined might finally find a way to shine. When Nikola Tesla finally came face to face with Thomas Edison, it was not a meeting of equals so much as a collision of two fundamentally different visions of how the world should be shaped. Edison was already a figure of authority in America's growing electrical industry, a man surrounded by workshops, assistants, investors, and noise. His world was loud, crowded, and relentlessly practical. Tesla entered this world quietly, carrying with him not a network of influence, but a mind that operated according to principles Edison neither shared nor fully trusted. From the very beginning, their encounter revealed not cooperation, but contrast. Edison believed in progress through endurance. He trusted brute effort, repetition, and incremental improvement. If something failed, he tried again and again and again, adjusting pieces until the system worked well enough to be sold. To him, invention was a process of elimination, a war of attrition against nature, won through persistence rather than elegance. Tesla, by contrast, believed that true progress required understanding before action. He saw invention as alignment rather than conquest, as a matter of discovering the correct principles and allowing systems to operate in harmony with them. Where Edison accepted inefficiency as the cost of success, Tesla saw inefficiency as a sign of misunderstanding. At first, this difference did not immediately erupt into conflict. Tesla was hired to improve Edison's direct current systems, and he approached the task with intense focus. He worked long hours, often through the night, redesigning generators, correcting faults, and solving problems that had stalled others. His mind moved faster than the environment around him, identifying weaknesses not through trial, but through clarity. To Tesla, the flaws in direct current were obvious: excessive loss over distance, rigid infrastructure, and a fundamental resistance to scalability. Still, he applied himself fully, believing that improvement, even within a flawed system, was worth pursuing. Edison noticed Tesla's productivity, but not his philosophy. He valued output over insight, solutions over explanations. Tesla's tendency to think ahead, to propose foundational changes rather than surface fixes, unsettled him. The two men spoke the same language of electricity, but they spoke it with different accents, shaped by opposing instincts. Edison distrusted theory. Tesla distrusted improvisation. Edison valued control. Tesla valued flow. Each believed the other misunderstood the nature of power itself. The tension between them deepened quietly. Tesla proposed alternatives that challenged the very foundation of Edison's business model. Alternating current, with its ability to travel long distances efficiently, threatened not only Edison's technology, but his financial empire. Edison had invested too much in direct current to consider abandoning it. To him, Tesla's ideas were not merely technical disagreements. They were disruptions, risks that could not be allowed to mature. What Tesla saw as inevitable progress, Edison saw as instability. There was also a personal divide. Edison thrived in chaos, surrounded by people, noise, and constant activity. Tesla required order, silence, and precision. Edison tolerated mess and imperfection. Tesla found them unbearable. Their working styles clashed daily. Tesla grew frustrated with the waste he observed, the lack of conceptual clarity, the resistance to fundamental change. Edison grew irritated by Tesla's unwillingness to accept compromise, his insistence on principles over practicality. Respect existed, but it was strained, conditional, and fragile. The breaking point came not with a dramatic argument, but with disillusionment. Tesla realized that no amount of effort would align Edison's world with his own. Promises were made and withdrawn. Rewards were implied and then dismissed. Tesla, who had believed that excellence would naturally be recognized, began to understand that innovation alone was not enough. Power required strategy, negotiation, and a willingness to navigate systems built on profit rather than possibility. This realization struck him deeply, not as anger, but as quiet disappointment. Leaving Edison's employ was both inevitable and painful. Tesla walked away not only from a job, but from the illusion that brilliance would be welcomed without resistance. He left poorer than before, carrying little more than his ideas, and a growing awareness of how hostile progress could be to those who challenged established control. Yet this departure also marked a subtle liberation. Free from the constraints of Edison's system, Tesla could now pursue electricity as he truly understood it, not as a commodity to be defended, but as a force to be refined. The meeting between Tesla and Edison would later be mythologized as a rivalry, simplified into a battle of personalities. But in truth, it was something deeper and more revealing. It was a meeting between two philosophies of power. One sought to dominate nature through force and repetition. The other sought to cooperate with it through insight and balance. The conflict was not personal. It was structural, inevitable, and reflective of a world struggling to decide how the future should be built. Tesla emerged from this encounter altered but not defeated. He had learned that light could not be given freely without resistance, that systems of control rarely yield without conflict. Yet he had also learned something equally important, that compromise with misunderstanding would only delay the inevitable. The path ahead would be harder, lonelier, and far more uncertain, but it would be his. And somewhere beyond the noise of workshops and the glare of competing ambitions, the quiet logic of alternating current waited, patient and unchanged, ready for the moment the world would finally be prepared to listen. What later history would call the War of Currents did not begin as a war at all. It began quietly, almost invisibly, in the space between two ways of thinking about energy and control. For Nikola Tesla, electricity was not something to be forced into obedience, but something to be guided, allowed to move according to its natural tendencies. Alternating current, rising and falling in rhythmic cycles, felt to him like breathing, like tides responding to the pull of unseen forces. For his opponents, however, electricity was something to be restrained, kept predictable, confined within rigid lines that could be measured, owned, and sold. As these two visions spread across America, conflict became inevitable, not because either side sought destruction, but because only one could shape the future's infrastructure. Tesla watched as the resistance to alternating current grew louder and more aggressive. Thomas Edison and his supporters framed direct current as safe and civilized, while portraying alternating current as dangerous, unstable, even lethal. Demonstrations were staged where animals were electrocuted to instill fear. Pamphlets circulated warning of invisible death flowing through wires. Public opinion was manipulated carefully, not through truth, but through spectacle. Tesla, sensitive to noise and cruelty, found these tactics deeply unsettling. To him, the violence was not merely physical, but conceptual, an assault on understanding itself. Electricity, he believed, was being judged not by its nature, but by the fear it inspired in those unwilling to relinquish control. Despite this hostility, Tesla remained remarkably calm. He did not engage in public attacks or sensational counterclaims. His response was quieter, more disciplined. He refined his systems, improved their efficiency, demonstrated their elegance through clarity rather than intimidation. Alternating current could travel vast distances with minimal loss. It could be transformed, scaled, adapted. It required fewer resources and offered greater reach. To Tesla, these were not advantages to be shouted, but truths that would reveal themselves naturally once given the chance. He trusted that the logic of nature would eventually outlast manufactured fear. Still, the pressure was immense. Investors hesitated. Cities hesitated. Safety boards hesitated. The world stood at a crossroads, uncertain which current would light its streets. Tesla, often isolated and financially unstable, felt the weight of this hesitation personally. He had sacrificed comfort, stability, and recognition for an idea that now faced organized resistance. There were moments when doubt crept in. Not doubt about the science, but doubt about humanity's readiness. Could the world accept a system it did not fully understand, one that challenged existing power structures so completely? Or would fear win simply because it spoke louder? The struggle reached beyond engineering into philosophy. Direct current represented centralization, limitation, proximity. Power stations had to be close. Control had to be local. Alternating current represented distribution, reach, connection. Power could travel far, crossing cities and landscapes with ease. To some, this felt like liberation. To others, it felt like loss. Tesla understood this intuitively. He saw that the resistance was not truly about safety, but about who would shape the future and who would profit from it. Electricity was becoming the nervous system of modern life, and whoever controlled it would influence everything that followed. As the conflict intensified, Tesla found an ally in George Westinghouse, a man willing to look beyond immediate fear and recognize long-term possibility. Westinghouse did not fully understand Tesla's mind, but he respected its coherence. Together, they pushed alternating current forward, not as a weapon, but as a solution waiting for acceptance. Demonstrations were held, systems installed, lights powered smoothly and reliably. Slowly, almost reluctantly, the world began to notice that the feared current did not bring chaos, but consistency. Streets glowed, factories ran. Homes lit up with a steadiness that direct current could not match. For Tesla, this period was emotionally complex. Victory, when it came, did not feel triumphant. There were no celebrations, no sense of conquest. Instead, there was a quiet relief tempered by exhaustion. The war of currents had demanded more than technical brilliance. It had demanded endurance in the face of distortion and resistance. Tesla had watched truth compete with fear and had learned how fragile understanding could be when threatened by power. The experience deepened his detachment from public acclaim. He became even more inward, more cautious, less willing to explain himself to a world that so easily misunderstood. Yet the outcome was undeniable. Alternating current began to spread, not because it was loved, but because it worked. Cities expanded. Distance lost its meaning. Energy flowed outward, reaching places once condemned to darkness. The logic Tesla had trusted proved stronger than resistance built on control. The light he envisioned began to appear, not as a spectacle, but as an ordinary presence that quietly reshaped daily life. The war of currents ended not with a clear declaration, but with a gradual shift, a slow acceptance that the future had chosen its path. Direct current did not disappear entirely, but it receded into niches, while alternating current became the backbone of modern power. Tesla watched this transition with a mix of satisfaction and distance. He had never sought dominance. He had sought alignment, and alignment, once achieved, required no applause. In the end, the conflict taught Tesla something essential. Progress was not merely a matter of being right. It required patience, resilience, and a willingness to endure misunderstanding. Light, he learned, does not arrive all at once. It spreads gradually, overcoming resistance not by force, but by persistence. And as alternating current continued to flow through wires and cities across the world, Tesla understood that the quiet logic he had followed since childhood had finally found its way into reality, illuminating not only streets and homes, but the direction of an entire century. After the noise of public conflict faded, After the demonstrations, arguments, and slow acceptance of alternating current began to settle into everyday reality, Nikola Tesla found himself facing a quieter and far more personal struggle. It was not resistance from rivals that wounded him most, but the gradual disappearance of support from those who had once believed in him. The world had begun to use his ideas, but it had not learned how to protect the man who carried them. And so, at the moment when his work proved its worth, Tesla's position became strangely unstable, as though success itself had loosened the ground beneath his feet. George Westinghouse had been Tesla's strongest ally during the War of Currents, not because he fully shared Tesla's vision, but because he recognized its necessity. Yet even this partnership was built within the fragile framework of money, contracts, and pressure from investors who feared uncertainty more than stagnation. As alternating current systems expanded, financial strain followed, lawsuits accumulated, competition intensified. Westinghouse faced the risk of collapse, and with it, the collapse of everything Tesla's system depended on. In this environment, loyalty was tested not by ideals, but by survival. Tesla had negotiated a royalty agreement that would have made him unimaginably wealthy if enforced. Every generator, every system built on his patents owed him a share. It was a future of security he had never sought, but had nonetheless earned. Yet when Westinghouse's company began to falter, Tesla was presented with a choice that revealed the core of his character. He could insist on his rights and protect his own future, or he could release the burden and allow the system he believed in to survive. There was no public debate, no dramatic confrontation. Tesla quietly tore up the contract, sacrificing personal wealth to preserve the spread of alternating current. This decision, though often romanticized later, was devastating in its consequences. Tesla did not view it as noble. He viewed it as necessary. Money, to him, had always been secondary to clarity and progress. Yet the loss was real. It meant that the man whose ideas powered cities would remain financially fragile, dependent on patrons who admired his past more than they understood his future. In choosing silence over confrontation, Tesla secured the world's light at the cost of his own stability. As years passed, this pattern repeated itself. Investors appeared briefly, drawn by Tesla's reputation, then vanished when his ideas stretched too far beyond immediate profit. Promises were made and quietly withdrawn. Funding arrived late or not at all. Tesla learned that belief was often temporary, especially when innovation demanded patience rather than spectacle. Each betrayal was subtle, wrapped in polite language and practical excuses, yet together they formed a steady erosion of trust. Tesla responded not with anger, but with withdrawal. He spoke less. He explained less. He retreated into his work, convinced that ideas, once released, would find their own way even if their creator was left behind. Public recognition mattered little to him, but misunderstanding weighed heavily. He watched others profit from technologies rooted in his insights, while his own projects stalled for lack of support. The world praised the results while neglecting the process, celebrating light without acknowledging the cost of imagining it. Silence became his refuge. He avoided confrontation, not because he feared it, but because it drained him. Negotiations exhausted his sensitive mind. Conflict disrupted the internal order he relied upon. Tesla preferred isolation to compromise, clarity to persuasion. In choosing this path, he preserved his inner world, but at the price of influence. He became increasingly invisible in the very system he had helped create. This period marked a turning point. Tesla understood now that progress did not guarantee protection, and truth did not ensure loyalty. The future could be built using his ideas without carrying him along with it. This realization did not break him, but it hardened something within. He stopped expecting fairness. He stopped trusting structures built on profit. He placed his faith instead in the quiet endurance of principles, believing that even if the world forgot his name, it would still live inside the currents flowing through its walls. Betrayal did not end Tesla's work, but it changed its tone. From this point forward, his inventions would grow bolder, more isolated, less constrained by practicality. Support had proven temporary. Silence, he learned, was permanent. And in that silence, Tesla continued to think, to imagine, and to carry light forward, even as the hands that once steadied him gradually let go. There are moments when history changes, not with noise or celebration, but with a quiet, collective realization that something irreversible has begun. For Nikola Tesla, that moment arrived not in a laboratory or a boardroom, but in the glow of light spreading calmly across a city, behaving exactly as he had always known it would. After years of resistance, doubt, and personal loss, alternating current finally stepped out of theory and controversy and became part of everyday life. It did not announce itself as a revolution. It simply worked, and in doing so, it changed the world. George Westinghouse played a crucial role in this transformation, not as a visionary in Tesla's sense, but as someone willing to stand beside an idea long enough for it to prove itself. Where Tesla saw systems in their ideal form, Westinghouse understood the realities of scale, infrastructure, and public trust. Their partnership was imperfect, shaped by pressure and compromise, yet it allowed alternating current to move from isolated demonstrations into full implementation. The defining moment came with the lighting of the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago, a vast public event meant to celebrate progress, industry, and the promise of a new century. When night fell over the exposition grounds and thousands of lights illuminated buildings, walkways, and fountains with a steady, almost unreal brightness, the effect was overwhelming. Visitors stood silently, unsure of how to respond. Light had never behaved this way before. It did not flicker weakly or fade with distance. It arrived cleanly, evenly, transforming darkness into something navigable and safe. This was not merely illumination, it was reassurance. Electricity, once feared and misunderstood, now revealed itself as controlled, reliable, and elegant. Tesla's alternating current had passed its most important test, not in technical journals, but in the shared human experience of standing beneath light that felt permanent. Tesla himself moved quietly through the exhibition, observing reactions rather than seeking attention. He did not give speeches. He did not claim credit. He watched faces soften as fear gave way to curiosity, then acceptance. In that moment, the years of struggle, betrayal, and isolation found their answer. The world might never fully understand how this light came to be, but it no longer questioned its existence. Alternating current was no longer an idea. It was infrastructure. The success in Chicago was followed by an even greater demonstration of scale, the harnessing of Niagara Falls. Where once roaring water symbolized untamed nature, it now became a source of power guided by Tesla's principles. Electricity traveled miles from the falls to nearby cities, proving beyond doubt that energy could be generated far from where it was used. Distance, once a limitation, dissolved. This achievement marked the true beginning of the modern electrical age, and at its core lay the rotating fields Tesla had first seen years earlier in the silence of his own mind. Yet for Tesla, this moment did not feel like victory. There was no sense of arrival, no relief that struggle was over. Instead, there was a quiet confirmation, almost subdued, that the logic he trusted had been correct all along. The light did not belong to him. It belonged to the world now. And with that transfer came an unexpected emptiness. The goal he had oriented himself toward for so long had been reached, and yet his personal circumstances remained uncertain. Recognition did not bring security. Success did not restore what had been lost. Still, something fundamental had changed. The world had accepted a new relationship with energy, one based on flow rather than force. Homes, factories, and streets would never return to darkness in the same way again. The glow that spread across cities at night carried within it Tesla's quiet philosophy, that nature, when understood, does not resist cooperation. It responds. As alternating current became ordinary, Tesla became increasingly invisible. His presence was no longer required for the system to grow. Engineers refined it, companies expanded it, governments regulated it. The light continued to spread without asking permission from the man who had imagined it. Tesla watched this from a distance, neither resentful nor proud, simply aware that his role had always been temporary. He had never intended to own the future. He had only wanted to open it. This moment, when the world first truly glowed, did not mark the end of Tesla's journey. It marked a transition. The problem he had devoted himself to had been solved, but his mind, restless and forward-looking, had already moved on. Light was no longer the question. The question became what else energy might do, how much further it could reach, and whether the world was ready to follow where his thoughts were already going. In the steady illumination of cities newly awakened at night, Nikola Tesla stood quietly at the edge of accomplishment, knowing that the light now belonged to everyone, even as he prepared to walk once more into solitude. After the world had accepted alternating current and the glow of electric light became ordinary, Nikola Tesla felt an unfamiliar restlessness settle over him. The problem that had consumed him for years had been solved, yet his mind did not know how to remain still. While others refined and commercialized his ideas, Tesla sensed that electricity still held deeper secrets, ones that could not be uncovered in crowded cities filled with wires, schedules, and expectations. He needed space, silence, and distance from industry. And so, in 1899, he traveled west again, this time not toward people, but toward emptiness, arriving in the high plains of Colorado Springs. Colorado Springs offered Tesla something rare: altitude, open sky, and isolation. The air was thin and dry, storms arrived with dramatic clarity, and lightning cracked across the sky with a force that felt almost personal. Here, far from financial pressure and public scrutiny, Tesla could return to pure exploration. He built a laboratory on the outskirts of town, a simple structure housing coils, generators, and towering apparatus designed not for practical application, but for understanding. To the local residents, the lab seemed strange and unsettling. At night, flashes of light burst from its roof, and thunder echoed even when the sky was clear. To Tesla, it felt like home. In Colorado Springs, Tesla's experiments grew bold and unrestrained. He was no longer content with powering machines or lighting buildings. He wanted to speak directly to the planet itself. He believed that the Earth was not merely a surface to be wired, but a conductor capable of carrying electrical energy across vast distances if properly tuned. He imagined a world where power could be transmitted without wires, where energy flowed freely through the ground and air, reaching anyone who knew how to receive it. This idea was not driven by profit or convenience. It was philosophical. Tesla believed energy was a shared resource, and that nature itself had already built the infrastructure humanity failed to recognize. His experiments in Colorado were intense and often frightening to observe. He generated electrical discharges that leapt through the air in blinding arcs, bolts that stretched dozens of feet, filling the lab with sound like artillery fire. Sparks danced across metal surfaces. Instruments failed. Transformers burned out. On one occasion, Tesla reportedly knocked out power across part of the town, overloading the local generator. These moments did not disturb him. Failure here was information. Each breakdown revealed another boundary, another rule written into the behavior of energy. Tesla spent long nights alone in the laboratory, listening. He believed electricity spoke in patterns, and he trained himself to notice subtle variations in frequency and resonance. It was during this time that he claimed to detect rhythmic signals from the Earth itself, natural oscillations, pulses that suggested the planet behaved like a massive electrical system. He even speculated, cautiously but earnestly, that some of the signals he recorded might not be terrestrial at all. While later interpretations would vary, what mattered most was not the conclusion, but the method. Tesla was not guessing. He was observing, measuring, and comparing, guided by the same discipline that had always anchored his imagination. Isolation suited him. Free from social obligations, Tesla returned to strict routines that preserved his mental clarity. He slept little, worked obsessively, and lived with minimal comfort. Meals were simple. Conversation was rare. The vast landscape mirrored his inner world, open, quiet, and demanding focus. In the evenings, he often stepped outside to watch storms roll across the plains, lightning branching endlessly across the sky. Unlike others, he did not flinch. He watched carefully, studying the timing, the shape, the rhythm, as though the sky were writing something meant only for him. Yet even in this solitude, there was a subtle shift in Tesla's life. The work in Colorado Springs was no longer anchored to immediate application. It drifted closer to speculation, to ideas so large they struggled to find practical footing. Wireless energy transmission, global communication, planetary resonance. These concepts reached far beyond what technology and funding could support at the time. Tesla sensed this gap, but pressed forward anyway, convinced that understanding must come before feasibility. He was less concerned with whether the world could follow than with whether the truth could be uncovered. When Tesla eventually left Colorado Springs, he carried with him notebooks filled with observations and calculations, many of which he never fully realized. The experiments had deepened his belief that energy connected everything, that boundaries between earth, air, and mind were thinner than assumed. But they had also marked a turning point. The path ahead would be harder. The ideas he now pursued were no longer easily translated into demonstrations the public could grasp. The silence he cherished would soon return, heavier and more permanent. Colorado Springs was a place where Tesla stood closest to the raw forces he had always sensed beneath reality. It was where he spoke not to investors or rivals, but to the sky and the ground beneath his feet. And though the world would remember these experiments as strange or excessive, for Tesla, they represented something essential. A moment when he was free to listen without interruption, reaching beyond light itself toward the deeper language of energy that had been calling to him since childhood. When Nikola Tesla returned from Colorado Springs, he carried with him more than notebooks filled with calculations and observations. He carried a conviction that bordered on certainty. The future of energy did not belong to wires. To Tesla, cables were temporary solutions, crude extensions of a deeper truth humanity had not yet accepted. Nature itself, he believed, was already wired. The earth, the air, and the atmosphere formed a vast, interconnected system, capable of transmitting energy if approached with understanding rather than force. What he had glimpsed in the silence of the plains now demanded expression on a global scale. Tesla began to speak of wireless power not as a convenience, but as a necessity for human progress. Wires, he argued, created borders between cities and countryside, between those who could afford infrastructure and those who could not. Wireless transmission, by contrast, promised equality. Energy could be available everywhere, not owned, not restricted, but shared, like air or sunlight. This vision was not born from political ideology, but from Tesla's deep belief that natural forces did not belong to individuals or corporations. They belonged to the world. At the center of this dream was resonance. Tesla believed that every object, including the Earth itself, possessed a natural frequency, and that when energy was introduced at precisely the right rhythm, it could travel vast distances with minimal loss. He had seen hints of this behavior in Colorado Springs, where electrical effects appeared far beyond what conventional theory predicted. To him, these were not anomalies, but confirmations. The planet responded. The challenge was not to overpower it, but to listen carefully enough to match its tone. Tesla's ideas expanded rapidly. He envisioned a global system that would transmit not only electrical power, but information, voice, images, signals, all traveling invisibly through the air, accessible from anywhere. Long before radios, satellites, or wireless networks became reality, Tesla described a world where distance no longer isolated, where communication was instant and universal. He spoke calmly about handheld devices capable of receiving signals from across the globe, about synchronized systems connecting continents, about a future where knowledge moved as freely as thought. To many, these ideas sounded fantastical. To Tesla, they were simply logical extensions of principles already observed. Yet, as his vision grew, so did the gap between him and the world around him. Investors, already cautious after the costly battles of the War of Currents, struggled to see immediate profit in a system that could not be easily controlled or monetized. Wireless power threatened established models of ownership and distribution. If energy traveled freely, how could it be measured, billed, regulated? Tesla spoke of humanity's benefit. Investors spoke of return. The conversation rarely met in the middle. Despite this resistance, Tesla pressed forward. He began refining plans for a massive transmission system, one capable of demonstrating wireless energy on a scale too large to ignore. He believed that a single, undeniable success would shift perception permanently. Once the world witnessed power delivered without wires, fear and doubt would dissolve. The truth, he believed, would speak for itself, just as alternating current eventually had. There was also a personal urgency beneath these dreams. Tesla was aware, though he rarely admitted it, that time was not on his side. His body had endured years of strain, his finances remained unstable, and his reputation hovered in an uneasy space between admiration and skepticism. Wireless energy represented more than a new project. It represented validation, not of his ego, but of his lifelong way of seeing. If this dream could be realized, it would confirm that intuition, vision, and patience could indeed guide humanity forward, even when they appeared impractical. At the same time, Tesla's isolation deepened. He worked largely alone, surrounded by papers and prototypes that few could fully understand. Public lectures grew more abstract, filled with ideas that leapt beyond the audience's comfort. Where once he had demonstrated tangible machines, he now spoke of invisible systems, planetary resonance, and global harmony. The more he tried to explain, the further away many listeners felt. Silence, once chosen, began to close in around him again. Still, Tesla did not doubt himself. His confidence did not come from approval, but from coherence. The ideas fit together too perfectly to be dismissed. Each principle supported the next, forming a system as elegant as the rotating fields he had imagined years earlier. He trusted this internal alignment more than public opinion. If the world was not ready, that was not proof of error. It was proof of distance. Wireless power remained, in Tesla's mind, the natural conclusion of everything he had worked toward. Light had been only the beginning. Energy, he believed, could move freely, invisibly, endlessly, connecting humanity without barriers. The fact that others could not yet see this did not weaken the idea. It only delayed its arrival. As Tesla prepared to take the next step, to transform vision into demonstration once more, he stood at the edge of his most ambitious dream. The question was no longer whether the idea was true, but whether the world would allow it to exist. And in that question, Tesla unknowingly approached the most fragile chapter of his life, where belief, innovation, and reality would collide with consequences deeper than any technical failure. Wardenclyffe Tower rose from the quiet landscape of Long Island, like a promise not yet understood. To Nikola Tesla, it was not merely a structure of steel and wood, but the physical embodiment of everything he believed about energy, connection, and the future of humanity. This was meant to be the place where theory would finally become undeniable reality, where wireless transmission would step out of speculation and into the open air. Tesla imagined the tower as a global instrument, tuned to the Earth itself, capable of sending power and information across oceans without wires, borders, or permission. It was the most ambitious project of his life, and also the most fragile. At first, support came from powerful sources. J.P. Morgan, one of the era's most influential financiers, agreed to fund the project, though not fully understanding its scope. Morgan believed he was investing in a wireless communication system, something that could transmit messages across the Atlantic faster than any cable. Tesla accepted the funding, knowing that communication was only the surface of what Wardenclyffe could become. Power, freely transmitted, remained his true goal. but he spoke of it cautiously, aware that such an idea challenged the foundations of ownership and profit. Construction began with optimism. The tower grew steadily, its skeletal form reaching upward, while beneath it, Tesla designed a deep system of underground shafts and metal structures meant to anchor the project to the Earth itself. He believed the ground was as important as the air above, that energy would move through the planet as much as through the sky. Every detail was intentional. Every measurement mattered. Wardenclyffe was not built to impress. It was built to resonate. But as the tower rose, so did doubts. Morgan began to ask questions. Questions Tesla struggled to answer in terms investors understood. How would wireless power be measured? How would it be sold? How could it be controlled? Tesla spoke of benefit, of universality, of a world transformed by shared energy. Morgan spoke of markets and returns. The distance between them widened quietly, without argument, without resolution. When Tesla revealed that his system could transmit not only information, but power itself, Morgan's enthusiasm cooled. A system that could not be owned was not a system he could support. Funding slowed, then stopped. Tesla, unwilling to compromise the integrity of his vision, refused to scale the project down into something smaller and safer. Wardenclyffe was all or nothing. Without continued investment, construction stalled. Workers left. Equipment sat unused. The tower stood incomplete, exposed to wind and weather, a monument to potential interrupted. Tesla remained on site as long as he could, walking the grounds, adjusting calculations, still believing that if he could just demonstrate success, support would return. But success required resources he no longer had. As months turned into years, the dream unraveled. Creditors closed in. Legal pressure mounted. Tesla's reputation began to shift from visionary to impractical dreamer. He had bet everything on Wardenclyffe, not because it promised wealth, but because it promised truth. Watching it fail was not merely professional loss, it was personal collapse. The world, once again, had chosen caution over possibility. Eventually, the tower was abandoned. Tesla left quietly, carrying his papers and his silence with him. Years later, Wardenclyffe would be dismantled, sold for scrap, its materials repurposed for other uses. The structure meant to transmit energy to the world vanished piece by piece, without ceremony. No test was ever completed. No final demonstration was allowed to speak. Yet Wardenclyffe was not a failure in the way history often describes it. It failed not because the idea was flawed, but because it was too far ahead of the systems meant to support it. Tesla had built a future without securing permission from the present. The tower stopped midway, suspended between what was and what might have been. For Tesla, Wardenclyffe marked the end of something essential. After it, his projects would continue, but the scale of his dreams would rarely find physical form again. The tower remained with him, not as regret, but as quiet proof that some ideas arrive before the world has learned how to listen. After the collapse of Wardenclyffe, Nikola Tesla's relationship with money became clearer than ever, not because he spoke about it often, but because of how consistently he turned away from it. To many observers, his financial instability appeared tragic, even foolish, especially given how much of the modern world already relied on ideas he had introduced. But to Tesla, money had never been the measure of success, nor even a reliable indicator of value. It was a tool at best, a distraction at worst, and one he increasingly chose to ignore in favor of something he trusted more deeply: coherence between idea and principle. Tesla did not despise wealth, nor did he romanticize poverty. He simply found money incompatible with the way his mind worked. Financial negotiations required compromise, simplification, and constant attention to short-term outcomes. His ideas, by contrast, demanded patience, long horizons, and freedom from constraint. When forced to choose, Tesla consistently chose intellectual integrity over security. This choice was not dramatic or defiant. It was quiet, almost instinctive, as though refusing money was as natural to him as refusing noise or disorder. The most striking example of this attitude had already occurred years earlier, when Tesla released his royalty rights to Westinghouse. That decision alone cost him a fortune beyond calculation, yet he rarely spoke of it with regret. He believed that insisting on personal wealth at the expense of progress would have corrupted the very purpose of his work. Alternating current mattered more than ownership. The spread of light mattered more than recognition. Once the system was alive, Tesla felt no claim over it. To him, ideas belonged to nature first, and only temporarily passed through human hands. After Wardenclyffe, this philosophy became a way of survival. Invitations arrived for lectures, dinners, and honorary events. Tesla accepted some, declined many, living modestly in hotel rooms paid for by occasional benefactors who admired him more as a symbol than as a collaborator. He dressed neatly, ate sparingly, and maintained routines that minimized dependence. When money came, it passed through him quickly, used to support work or daily needs, never accumulated or guarded. Wealth required management. Management required attention. Attention, Tesla believed, belonged elsewhere. This refusal to engage with financial reality confused and frustrated those who wanted to help him. Friends urged him to patent more aggressively, to commercialize smaller ideas, to accept consulting roles that would bring stability. Tesla listened politely, but rarely acted. Fragmenting his work into profitable pieces felt like dismantling a living system for spare parts. He preferred the risk of instability to the certainty of dilution. In his mind, partial success achieved through compromise was more dangerous than failure achieved through honesty. There was also a deeper reason for his detachment. Tesla feared that wealth would tether him to expectations that would distort his thinking. Investors demanded timelines. Sponsors demanded results. Money created obligations, and obligations created noise. Tesla needed silence, mental and physical, to function. Even when his financial situation became precarious, he resisted solutions that would have bound him to agendas not aligned with his own. To outsiders, this appeared irrational. To Tesla, it was self-preservation. Over time, this stance isolated him further. The world of industry moved quickly, driven by profit and competition. Tesla moved slowly, guided by curiosity and internal consistency. As others built fortunes refining existing technologies, he pursued ideas too broad, too interconnected, too abstract to fit neatly into business models. His refusal of money was not rejection of the world, but rejection of its pacing. He lived according to a different rhythm, one that valued depth over speed and coherence over accumulation. Yet this choice carried a quiet cost. Financial insecurity limited what Tesla could build, where he could work, and how long he could sustain projects. The man who had illuminated cities found himself counting expenses, relying on the kindness of a few who remembered his brilliance. Still, he did not change. He did not resent those who profited. He did not chase what he had lost. He accepted the consequences as part of the path he had chosen. Tesla's refusal of money was not martyrdom. It was consistency. He believed that the future he imagined could not be purchased, only understood. And understanding, once reached, would outlast any currency. In a world increasingly shaped by transactions, Tesla remained guided by alignment, convinced that light, once released, did not belong to anyone, and that a life spent protecting that belief was worth the quiet price it demanded. By the time Nikola Tesla entered the later phase of his life, his name was known across the scientific and public world, yet his daily existence remained remarkably small and restrained. Newspapers still spoke of him as a genius, a visionary, a man ahead of his time. Invitations arrived bearing admiration and curiosity. Younger engineers mentioned him with respect, sometimes even awe. And yet, behind this public image, Tesla lived alone, quietly, moving through his days without the comfort or security that fame is supposed to bring. Recognition had found him, but belonging had not. Tesla's life settled into a pattern shaped by simplicity and distance. He lived mostly in hotels, modest rooms that allowed him to avoid permanence and obligation. These spaces were clean, orderly, and temporary, which suited his need for control and predictability. He arranged his belongings carefully, keeping few personal items beyond papers, notes, and the familiar objects that anchored his routines. He avoided excess not out of virtue, but necessity. Too much clutter disrupted his thoughts. Too much comfort dulled his focus. Silence and structure mattered more to him than luxury. Despite his reputation, Tesla rarely felt celebrated in a way that mattered. Public praise often misunderstood him, reducing his work to isolated achievements rather than recognizing the philosophy that connected them. He was invited to dinners and ceremonies where guests expected spectacle, dramatic pronouncements, or entertaining eccentricity. Tesla attended politely when he felt obligated, spoke carefully, and withdrew as soon as possible. These gatherings drained him. Conversation felt shallow. Applause felt misplaced. He sensed that people admired the idea of him more than the substance of what he was still trying to understand. Financially, his situation remained unstable. Though respected, he was no longer central to the industries he had helped create. Companies built upon his principles without requiring his presence. Progress moved forward efficiently, impersonally. Tesla watched this from the margins, not bitter, but quietly aware that the world had a habit of absorbing ideas while releasing the individuals who introduced them. His contributions were everywhere, yet his role in shaping the present was increasingly symbolic rather than practical. Loneliness became a constant, though not always painful, companion. Tesla had never married, never formed a traditional family, and now the absence of close personal relationships grew more noticeable. His sensitivity made intimacy difficult. Emotional closeness demanded energy he preferred to reserve for thought. Still, there were moments of quiet longing, hints that he felt the distance between himself and ordinary life. He watched couples in public spaces, families sharing meals, people bound together by routines he had never learned to share. He did not envy them, but he recognized that his path had required sacrifice beyond professional ambition. Yet within this quiet life, Tesla retained dignity. He dressed neatly, walked with composure, and carried himself with restraint. He did not complain publicly about his circumstances. He did not seek sympathy. When asked about his past, he spoke calmly, focusing on ideas rather than personal hardship. He believed that dwelling on loss wasted time better spent thinking forward. Even when his health declined and support thinned, he maintained routines that gave structure to his days, protecting his inner world from decay. Fame without comfort revealed a difficult truth to Tesla. Recognition did not guarantee understanding. Applause did not ensure continuity. The world could admire a man while leaving him alone. Yet he accepted this reality without resentment. His satisfaction did not come from how he was treated, but from knowing that his ideas continued to function in the world, quietly doing what they were meant to do. In this phase of his life, Tesla became a figure moving gently through public memory rather than shaping it directly. He lived simply, thought deeply, and carried on without expectation. The light he had helped create illuminated streets and homes across continents, while he himself returned each night to a quiet room, content not with comfort, but with the knowledge that the work, once released, no longer needed him to endure. As the world continued to expand outward, faster machines, brighter cities, louder ambitions, Nikola Tesla's life contracted gently inward, settling into a narrow, carefully maintained orbit. This was not retreat born of defeat, but a deliberate narrowing, a choice to protect what remained essential to him when so much else had fallen away. Tesla understood that his mind functioned best within strict boundaries, and so he built a small, precise world where routine replaced uncertainty and quiet replaced negotiation. In this world, the ordinary became sacred, and repetition became a form of stability. His days followed patterns almost ritualistic in their consistency. He woke at the same hours, walked the same routes, ate with mathematical precision, and returned each evening to the familiar order of his room. These routines were not eccentric habits meant to attract attention. They were safeguards. Disorder unsettled him deeply, pulling his thoughts into unwanted directions. Predictability, by contrast, allowed his mind to remain clear, unburdened by unnecessary decisions. Within this structure, he could think freely, even as the physical scope of his life grew smaller. It was during this period that Tesla formed his most unusual and misunderstood attachment, his bond with pigeons. Living in New York, he spent long hours walking through parks and quiet streets, observing birds with the same attentiveness he once gave to machines. He began feeding pigeons regularly, learning to recognize individual birds, noticing subtle differences in behavior and movement. To outsiders, this seemed strange, even pitiable, a great inventor reduced to the company of animals. But to Tesla, these birds represented something deeply comforting. They asked nothing of him. They did not demand explanation, funding, or compromise. They responded only to consistency and care. Among them, there was one pigeon in particular, white and distinct, to which Tesla felt especially connected. He spoke of this bird not sentimentally, but with reverence, describing it as though it embodied a purity of presence he rarely found among people. He once said that loving this pigeon brought meaning to his life when much else had faded. This was not loneliness expressed as weakness, but attachment shaped by sensitivity. Tesla's emotional world had always been intense and difficult to share. In the quiet trust of an animal that returned each day without judgment, he found a form of companionship that did not threaten his inner balance. At the same time, Tesla's routines grew more rigid. He avoided physical contact, feared contamination, and maintained strict rules about cleanliness and order. Certain sounds and textures distressed him. Numbers held particular significance, especially those divisible by 3. These behaviors, often labeled eccentric, were part of the same system that allowed his mind to function at all. They reduced chaos, filtered sensation, and kept his thoughts from fragmenting under stimulation. In a world growing louder and faster, Tesla responded by becoming quieter and more exact. Despite his isolation, his mind did not go dark. He continued to think, to calculate, to imagine futures no longer concerned with immediate feasibility. His notebooks filled with ideas about energy, physics, and human progress, many too abstract to attract support, yet internally consistent and deeply considered. He believed that even if these ideas were never built, they mattered as truths explored. Thinking itself remained his refuge, his purpose, and his discipline. Social interaction became increasingly rare. Tesla declined most invitations, avoided crowds, and limited conversation. When he did speak, his words were careful and precise, often misunderstood by those expecting spectacle or nostalgia. He was no longer interested in defending his legacy or correcting the world's perception of him. Explanation required energy, and energy was now reserved for thought. Silence, once chosen, became necessary. And yet, this smaller world was not empty. It was ordered, intentional, and alive with quiet meaning. The routines he followed gave shape to days that might otherwise have blurred together. The pigeons he fed anchored him to the present. The thoughts he pursued connected him to a future he knew he would never see. Within these boundaries, Tesla lived with a kind of calm the earlier phases of his life had never allowed. This period reveals something essential about Nikola Tesla. When stripped of power, influence, and public relevance, he did not collapse into bitterness or spectacle. He adapted, he refined, he reduced his life to what he could sustain without distortion. The small world he chose was not an escape from reality, but a carefully constructed environment where his mind could remain intact. In the end, Tesla did not measure his life by its reach, but by its coherence. And in the quiet repetition of his days, among routines and birds and thoughts unshared, he preserved the one thing that had always mattered most to him: the ability to listen inwardly, even as the world outside continued to move on without him. As the 20th century advanced, the world began to move at a pace that Nikola Tesla no longer set and scarcely recognized as his own. Cities grew taller and louder, industries expanded with ruthless efficiency, and new names filled newspapers: engineers, businessmen, inventors whose work built directly upon foundations Tesla had laid. Electricity spread everywhere, humming invisibly through walls and streets, powering machines, lights, and lives. And yet, as this world accelerated, Tesla himself drifted further from its center, becoming a figure spoken of in the past tense while still very much alive. This was not a sudden disappearance, but a gradual fading. Tesla did not fall from prominence through scandal or failure. He simply stopped being useful to the systems that now dominated progress. Industry no longer needed visionaries who questioned fundamentals. It needed refiners, optimizers, managers of complexity. Tesla's way of thinking, holistic, philosophical, oriented toward long horizons, did not fit comfortably into a world driven by quarterly returns and immediate applications. His ideas had become infrastructure, and infrastructure rarely remembers its origins. Newspapers still mentioned him from time to time, often in tones that felt strangely detached. Articles referred to him as an eccentric genius, a relic of a more romantic age of invention. Journalists visited his hotel room, expecting spectacle or madness, and left with stories that emphasized his habits rather than his thinking. Tesla read these pieces quietly, rarely responding. He understood that public memory simplifies. It prefers characters to complexity, anecdotes to systems. Correcting these impressions would require energy he no longer wished to spend. Meanwhile, technologies rooted in his work continued to evolve without his involvement. Electrical grids expanded. Radio communication emerged, often credited to others despite Tesla's earlier patents and demonstrations. Engineers refined alternating current systems, improving efficiency and reliability, while Tesla watched from a distance, neither resentful nor triumphant. He did not believe ideas belonged to individuals forever. Once released, they took on lives of their own. Still, there was a quiet dissonance in seeing his thoughts walk the world wearing someone else's name. This erasure was subtle but persistent. Invitations to speak diminished. Funding proposals went unanswered. Younger generations learned simplified versions of history that placed Tesla at the margins or reduced him to a single contribution. The narrative of progress favored linear stories with clear heroes, not complex figures whose work crossed boundaries and resisted categorization. Tesla, who had always lived between disciplines, found himself between eras as well. Too early for full recognition, too late for relevance. Living through this forgetting was not easy, but Tesla did not fight it. He had never sought to be remembered in conventional ways. His satisfaction came from coherence, not credit. Yet being forgotten while alive carried a particular weight. It meant watching the future arrive without invitation, knowing that one's presence was no longer required. Tesla felt this distance keenly, especially as his health declined and his world narrowed further. The silence that once protected him now echoed. Still, he continued to think. Even as public interest waned, his mind remained active, sketching ideas, revisiting theories, questioning assumptions. He spoke occasionally of new concepts, directed energy, advanced communication, deeper structures of physics. But these ideas no longer found listeners willing to follow them far. The gap between Tesla's thinking and the world's attention had grown too wide. His thoughts belonged to a future that had not yet decided to look back. There was dignity in how he carried this invisibility. Tesla did not retreat into bitterness or self-pity. He did not demand recognition or rewrite his story for easier consumption. He accepted that the world's memory was selective and that understanding often arrives long after its source has gone quiet. He believed, perhaps more than ever, that truth did not depend on timing and that ideas, if sound, would resurface when needed. In this phase of his life, Tesla became a living anachronism, a man shaped by questions larger than the era surrounding him. He walked city streets illuminated by currents he had imagined decades earlier, anonymous among crowds who benefited from his work without knowing his face. There was something profoundly lonely in this, but also something consistent with the way he had always lived. Tesla had never truly belonged to his time. He had always existed slightly ahead of it, speaking languages it struggled to understand. Being forgotten while alive did not erase his purpose. It clarified it. Tesla understood now that legacy is not something one controls. It unfolds according to needs yet to arise. The world had moved on, but it had done so along paths he helped carve. And even as his name faded from conversation, the systems he envisioned continued to function silently, waiting for the moment when curiosity would once again turn backward and ask how the light had first learned to travel so far. As Nikola Tesla moved deeper into old age, the quiet limitations of the body began to assert themselves in ways even his disciplined mind could not fully ignore. The energy that once carried him through nights of relentless thought and experimentation diminished gradually, not with drama, but with a steady insistence that rest was no longer optional. His health, never robust, became fragile. Digestion troubled him. Sleep grew irregular. Pain appeared without warning and lingered longer than before. For a man who had lived almost entirely inside his mind, the body's resistance felt foreign, even intrusive. Tesla responded to illness the same way he had responded to most challenges, with control and withdrawal. He avoided doctors when possible, distrusting treatments that felt imprecise or invasive. He adjusted routines meticulously, reducing meals, limiting movement, preserving energy for thinking. Each change was calculated, deliberate, an attempt to maintain equilibrium as the physical world pressed inward. He did not speak publicly about suffering. To do so would have felt like distraction, perhaps even surrender. Pain, like noise, was something to be managed quietly. Isolation deepened during this period, not because Tesla was entirely alone, but because connection required effort his body increasingly resisted. Walking became slower. Social obligations felt heavier. Even short conversations demanded recovery time. The small world he had chosen grew smaller still. Hotel rooms became more than temporary shelters. They became controlled environments where light, sound, and routine could be regulated with precision. Outside, the city continued to move rapidly. Inside, time stretched and softened, marked by repetition rather than progress. Despite physical decline, Tesla's mind remained active, though it turned inward more often than forward. He revisited old ideas, refined theories in silence, and reflected on patterns he had noticed across decades of thought. His notebooks filled not with plans for construction, but with observations, connections, and philosophical questions. The urgency to build had faded. What remained was the need to understand. Thinking itself became the work, no longer aimed at transformation of the world, but at coherence within it. There were moments of quiet sadness, though Tesla rarely named them. Watching the world advance technologically without him brought a sense of distance rather than envy. He read about new inventions, new wars, new systems of power, and recognized traces of his influence woven throughout. Yet the language had changed. The pace had changed. The world no longer spoke in ways that invited his participation. This was not rejection so much as evolution, and Tesla accepted it with a calm that surprised those who expected bitterness. Illness also sharpened his sensitivity. Light felt harsher. Sounds felt louder. Crowds felt overwhelming. He limited exposure carefully, choosing walks at odd hours and quiet streets where possible. The pigeons he fed remained a constant, a familiar rhythm unaffected by his slowing body. Their presence reassured him that some forms of connection did not depend on speed or productivity. Care, once given, returned predictably. As his strength waned, Tesla grew more reflective about time, not in terms of regret, but in terms of alignment. He considered whether his life had followed the logic he trusted so deeply. The answer, quietly, was yes. He had not achieved everything he imagined, but he had never betrayed the way he saw the world. His ideas had traveled farther than his body ever could. That felt sufficient. The isolation of illness stripped away any remaining illusions about recognition or rescue. No sudden return to prominence awaited him. No late-stage vindication arrived with ceremony. What remained was continuity, the steady persistence of thought, the internal consistency he had guarded all his life. In this sense, illness did not defeat him. It clarified him. It reduced the world to essentials, and within those essentials, he still functioned. Tesla did not fear death in a conventional sense. He feared confusion, distortion, loss of clarity. As long as his mind remained ordered, he felt intact. The body's decline was a fact, not a failure. He observed it as he had observed electrical phenomena decades earlier, noting changes, adjusting parameters, accepting limits. Control now meant acceptance rather than resistance. In these final years, Tesla lived at a slower frequency, tuned not to ambition or conflict, but to maintenance of inner balance. Illness isolated him physically, but it also protected him from noise he no longer wished to engage. The world grew distant, but it did not disappear. It continued to glow quietly, powered by currents he had once imagined, while he remained still, conserving what remained of himself. This period was not marked by achievement, but by endurance. And in that endurance, Tesla demonstrated one last form of mastery, not over machines or energy, but over the act of remaining whole as the body yielded to time. Nikola Tesla died the way he had lived for many years, quietly, without witnesses, without ceremony, without the world pausing to notice. On January 7th, 1943, in a small room of the New Yorker hotel, his life came to an end, not with thunder or brilliance, but with stillness. There were no machines humming beside him, no final experiment left running, no crowd gathered outside the door. The man who had spent his life thinking about energy, motion, and light passed away in silence, alone, as gently as one of his own systems settling into rest. In his final days, Tesla's routine remained intact. He ate little, slept irregularly, and kept to the narrow patterns that had sustained him through isolation and illness. His body had grown weak, but his habits endured, providing structure where strength could not. Hotel staff saw him less often. Walks became shorter, then stopped altogether. The pigeons he had fed so faithfully were absent now, replaced by quiet hours and dim light. There was no dramatic decline, only a gradual slowing, like a current losing amplitude, but not coherence. When his body was discovered, the world responded slowly. News of his death spread modestly, framed more as the passing of a curious figure than the loss of a foundational mind. Obituaries spoke of his eccentricities, his habits, his unrealized dreams. Some acknowledged his contributions to electrical engineering, though often briefly, as though summarizing something too complex to fully explain. There was respect, but it felt distant, incomplete. The world he had helped illuminate did not yet know how to speak about him clearly. In the hours after his death, government officials entered his room and seized his papers, driven by wartime fears and speculation about unfinished inventions. Rumors circulated almost immediately of secret weapons, of machines capable of unimaginable power. These stories said more about the world's anxiety than about Tesla's intentions. In truth, his notebooks contained far more reflection than threat, more curiosity than aggression. He had never sought domination. He had sought understanding. But mystery clung to him even in death, partly because he had never simplified himself for others. Tesla left no family behind, no household to dissolve, no personal estate of significance. His belongings were few. His wealth was minimal. What remained were ideas scattered across decades, embedded into systems that functioned so seamlessly people no longer noticed them. The light did not flicker when he died. The power did not fail. Trains ran. Cities glowed. The world continued exactly as it had the day before, quietly proving the depth of his influence without marking his absence. There is something profoundly fitting in this ending. Tesla had never believed that truth required applause. He had trusted that correct ideas would persist regardless of recognition. In that sense, his death was not a loss of power, but a release of responsibility. The work no longer needed him. It had become independent, woven into the fabric of daily life. Those who later looked back would begin to understand this more clearly. With distance came context. With time came appreciation. But in that hotel room, in that quiet moment, there was no sense of legacy being secured, only a life concluding according to its own rhythm. No resistance, no struggle, just stillness. Nikola Tesla did not die as a forgotten man, though it may have appeared so at the time. He died as a man whose work had already escaped him, flowing freely through the world without requiring his presence. The light he had helped release did not dim. It continued on, indifferent to loss, faithful to principle. And so, in a quiet room high above the streets of New York, the body of a solitary thinker came to rest, while the currents he once imagined moved endlessly onward, carrying his unseen signature into the future. Long after Nikola Tesla's body had been laid to rest, long after the quiet room was emptied and the city continued without pause, something essential of him remained everywhere. It was not his name spoken aloud, nor statues, nor clear ownership of invention. It was presence without visibility, influence without signature. The world did not remember Tesla the way it remembers conquerors or industrial giants. It remembered him the way it remembers gravity, by living inside the effects without questioning their origin. Every night, when cities glowed without hesitation, his thinking moved invisibly through walls and wires. Every time electricity traveled great distances without losing its strength, his logic was at work. Alternating current became so normal that it vanished into the background of life, which was perhaps the most Tesla-like outcome imaginable. He had never wanted attention to cling to his ideas. He wanted them to function, and they did. In the years following his death, recognition arrived slowly, unevenly, often imperfectly. Historians began to revisit old patents. Engineers rediscovered notes once dismissed as impractical. New generations, standing on technologies Tesla could only imagine, started to see how many of their foundations traced back to a quiet man who preferred thinking to claiming. His reputation shifted from eccentric curiosity to essential origin, though even then, understanding lagged behind admiration. Tesla's true legacy was not a single invention, but a way of seeing the world. He believed that nature was not chaotic, but patterned. That energy did not need to be dominated, only understood. That progress was not achieved by force, but by alignment. These ideas aged well. As humanity confronted the limits of extraction, control, and endless growth, Tesla's philosophy began to feel less like fantasy and more like warning. There is a deep irony in how his life ended compared to what he gave the world. He lived quietly so that others could live loudly. He accepted obscurity so that systems could endure without dependence on his name. He paid for coherence with comfort, for truth with isolation. And yet, nothing he created was wasted. The light did not forget him, even when people did. Tesla did not teach kings or command armies. He did not rule institutions or shape policy. He changed the world by insisting, again and again, that it could work differently. That distance was not an obstacle. That darkness was not permanent. That the future could be built gently if one listened carefully enough to how the universe already behaved. In this sense, Tesla never truly belonged to his time. He belonged to the intervals between eras, to moments when old systems strain and new ones are not yet clear. He belonged to the future, not as prophecy, but as structure. His thoughts were scaffolding, invisible once the building stood, essential even when unnoticed. And so, when we speak of Nikola Tesla as the man who lit the world, we do not mean that he stood at the center of attention, holding a flame. We mean that he rearranged the darkness so thoroughly that light could move on its own, that he trusted ideas enough to let them outgrow him, that he accepted silence so the world could glow. His life reminds us of something easily forgotten, that the most powerful forces are often quiet, that the deepest changes leave no footprints, and that some people exist not to be remembered loudly, but to make forgetting impossible. The light is still on, and it does not need to say his name.